Okay, I thought I'd spend this lesson talking a little bit about some of the things that I mentioned in previous videos, being that of forearm weight, pit grip and relaxing that, and all of those kind of topics. There's a couple of things that I think are potentially missing from some of those videos, which some people get confused by. And one of the first things that I got asked by a new student of mine was, well, if you've got such a relaxed grip on the wrist and relaxed grip on the forearm and etc., and everything's so relaxed, then surely where you play, how do you actually place your hand on the guitar properly so that you've got some control over what you're doing? Now, this actually isn't as obvious as it may seem. So, first things first, when you want to try and get a lot of control out of the picking hand, the wrist has to be free to move, because that's what's making all the fine motor control movements to get around the strings and to actually, make you play things cleanly and also with some amount of relaxation to them and good flow, etc., etc. So what you want to try and do is I try and actually put some force into the back of my forearm here. So if you pull the guitar in this way and you try and actually push down using some of the shoulder muscle there, so we're not talking about relaxing this necessarily, you're actually trying to pull the arm almost over the top of it, like a bass player maybe would. So bass players often, if they've got slightly questionable technique, they'll do this with their wrist. And the reason why this still kind of works is because the wrist is still free to make loads of adjustments like this, even when it's at this really extreme angle that bass players use. So we can kind of approximate that same thing, but by pulling back this way, so that the wrist here, if I turn sideways, it's much more obvious. You can see it's kind of been pushed out a little bit. So even the difference between here and here is massive in terms of what it allows you to do with string skipping and what it allows you to do with moving that wrist in a motion that's a bit more controlled. So to show you that, if I push in here like this, you can get the speed of it just about. But I wouldn't be that confident in that kind of technique doing that live, because it feels like I'm using quite a lot of force to do it. And I'm kind of brute forcing all the motions there, which isn't that beneficial. Whereas if I push in here, you kind of see every time I'm making a string skip upwards, because I've got this pull back here, it's much easier for me to track that. Whereas if I was here, I have to do some really weird wrist motions, which isn't ideal for what you want to do. So you can kind of practice this by trying to put the tension in the back of the guitar, normally on the where this kind of curves off on a standard Stratocaster is a good way of starting. It's like somewhere around here, they're trying to pull that back, and then try and make sure that you're keeping that grip relaxed. So when I'm trying to pick one string here, that kind of thing, I'm not squeezing too hard to do it, none of that. Still a really relaxed grip. Even with those kinds of, really fast Paul Gilbert-y things, this kind of stuff, it's all pulled back here with the wrist being allowed to move and being super loose. What locks up the wrist is not putting tension into the back of the forearm here and pulling back with the forearm. It's actually tensing the grip. And you can do this again, I've talked about this a lot off the guitar. If you tense the grip and you try and move that wrist, you've completely locked it up already. So the wrist has to be, your grip has to be super loose in order for the wrist to be super loose with all of that stuff. But it's nice sometimes to have a really solid point of contact with the instrument. So that's when we talk about, if I put this here and I put it down pretty hard, the wrist is still really loose here and I can do that, but I'm not going to get lost. If I'm floating everything, if I'm like this and playing like that, I've got no reference points to actually use there. And having absolutely no reference points doesn't make your life easier, even if it seems like it's super relaxed. You kind of want to have at least a couple of places where you're touching. Now with the mute, this is an interesting little problem. So if you're trying to play that one note per string stuff like this, I'm not very warmed up on that. That kind of stuff, and we're trying to like really get that one note per string thing going. You need another contact point, which is normally this point here, which Andy Wood uses this, I know he does, which is like this bone here on the side of the hand. But the difference here is massive, because if I just push in there and I rest the weight of my hand there, I can't move this wrist very well, because again I'm locking it out because I'm using that as my point of contact. Whereas if I use this as my point of contact and then rest that on the bridge, but it's not actually taking the weight of my arm anymore because it's pushed in here, you'll notice that I can actually I need to warm up into this. That's a bit better. So, you know, I haven't warmed up today, so like this is why this is looking a little bit sloppy from me, but the idea being all of this stuff is a lot easier now because I'm pulling back here and I can track that from this point on the bridge here. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that with everything. So, you know, you might find that that's very useful for one note per string stuff, but then two note per string, I find if I try and trap my wrist here, it doesn't really work. So I need to be a bit more, like float the wrist a little bit more, but still pull back here. That feels a little bit easier to do that. It's the same with a lot of the three note per string stuff. So I find if I stick my wrist here, it's harder than if I just have it. Have it floating a little bit. So, you know, with a bit of warm up and without cold hands, that's pretty clean for me now. Whereas before, when I was trying to like stick my hand to the bridge really hard and put the weight of my arm onto that, wasn't necessarily the case. Now this brings up a really interesting conundrum, which is I actually think a lot of people who are on have shorter forearms and generally less tall actually have an easier job of this because of the fact that it's actually much easier to ergonomically place your forearms on the guitar in a way that's comfortable, whereas a lot of people with a bit longer levers have a little bit of a problem with that, because generally speaking, if I was to do it the same way as most people can, I've got quite long arms, you can see where I end up here, and that then makes my technique very questionable. So it's a bit of an interesting little conundrum where I think actually height and you know, particularly length of the forearm is actually making quite a massive difference to how people pick up the instrument in the first place, and you know, what they find easy and what they find difficult, which is not something, again, I think is ever talked about, because you know it's always the case of like, oh, if you just practice enough you'll get it, but sometimes you have to make very extreme adjustments for very particular reasons. I've got a current student of mine who has some of the biggest hands I've ever seen anyone, and we're currently looking at getting a much wider guitar for him on a custom nut width, because of the fact that actually it's physically impossible for him to fret one note without touching the other strings. That's how big his hands are. So it gives you an idea that sometimes you have to make some adjustments that look slightly strange but might actually benefit you more. So, you know, with me, I have to pull back harder here to get that straight line or that slightly bent wrist out here, whereas some people, they can just put their arm on the guitar and automatically have that, which I don't have, and I've realised is actually causing me a bit of a problem. So anyway, some stuff to think about, some stuff to work on, and hopefully that's been a useful one.